Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. First story, Something's Down There. When I was young, life felt slower and simpler, even though the world around us was often unpredictable. I lived with my family not too far from a great river, one that stretched wide and deep under a gorge. It wasn't exactly in our backyard. There was a street and a grassy field between us and the river's edge, but it was close enough for me and my cousins to sneak away and explore when our parents weren't watching. Of course, they worried endlessly. To them, the river wasn't just water and rocks. It was a dangerous expanse where accidents happened. And though I didn't understand their fear back then, I would come to learn why their voices always tightened when they told us to stay away. The story I'm about to share isn't so much about me, but about my uncle, the man who knew the river better than anyone, and yet came close to losing his life to it. My uncle was a true outdoorsman, the kind of man who seemed like he belonged to the wilderness more than to any town or city. He had the rugged tan of someone who worked under the sun every day and strong, capable hands marked by years of manual labor. Fishing was his passion, but not the kind of fishing you might picture with a boat and rod. He and his friends had a unique way of doing it. They would take the inner tubes of giant truck tires, inflate them, and use them as floating platforms. Lying belly down on the rubber rings, they'd paddle out to the deep parts of the river, dragging a wide net behind them. He always claimed that the fish saw the floating tubes as harmless debris and didn't spook as easily, making it the best way to provide for his family. The river itself was a contradiction, beautiful yet treacherous. In some areas the water was only a few feet deep, the current slow and gentle. There, the riverbed was firm enough that even a child could walk across without slipping. But then there were the other places, the dark, deep sections, where the water dropped as far as 25 feet, and the current moved with strange, powerful energy. Those parts were intimidating even to experienced swimmers. My uncle and his friends always fished in these murky depths, where the water seemed alive with secrets. It came as no surprise that people occasionally drowned there. Our parents warned us of the river's dangers again and again, but they also whispered darker tales, ones they didn't fully believe themselves. One such story was of a boy who swam in the deep section and was never seen again. They said he wasn't swept away by the current or dragged down by a cramp. No, something had pulled him under. My uncle would tell us this story to keep us away from the river, and he'd always add a chilling detail. A shukuro, a malevolent merman of folklore, prowled the river's depths, waiting to drown unsuspecting swimmers. At the time, only the youngest and most gullible among us believed him. That is, until my uncle had his own terrifying encounter. Years later, he shared his story with us, though he spoke hesitantly, as if even recalling it made him uneasy. It was an ordinary day when it happened. My uncle and two of his friends were fishing in their usual way, floating on the tubes in the deep, murky water. That day, the current felt unusually strong, but their inner tubes were anchored to the riverbank with ropes, so they weren't drifting far. After a while, my uncle noticed he was getting pulled slightly farther out than the others. His rope had uncoiled too much, giving him more slack than intended. He tried to paddle back closer, but then, out of nowhere, his tube jolted violently, far harder than the current alone could explain. At first, he thought it was just turbulence from the water, or maybe he'd bumped into an underwater branch. But as he shifted his weight to steady himself, the tube jolted again, even harder. And then it happened. His tube was yanked sharply to one side, and before he could react, he was in the water. My uncle was an excellent swimmer, so at first he wasn't too alarmed. He'd fallen into rivers before, but this was different. He felt something pulling on him, dragging him downward. The water was murky and cold, and visibility was almost zero. But through the cloudy brown-green depths, he caught glimpses of a dark shadow swirling around his legs. Something unseen wrapped around his ankles and tugged sharply, preventing him from kicking to the surface. Panic rose in his chest as his lungs began to burn for air. He flailed, trying to break free, but whatever it was tightened its grip. It wasn't the current. Currents pulled sideways, not straight down. This felt deliberate, like hands or claws clutching at him. Fortunately, one of his friends noticed his thrashing. At first they thought he was being careless and about to scare the fish, but then they saw how frantically he struggled. Without hesitation, his friend paddled over and grabbed him by the arm, yanking hard. With a final desperate kick, my uncle broke free of whatever had been holding him and burst to the surface, coughing and gasping. They pulled him onto a tube and together they made their way back to shore, shaken and silent. When they reached the riverbank, my uncle examined his legs and found fresh, bleeding cuts circling his ankles, narrow and sharp like claw marks. None of them spoke for a long time, but the silence said everything. Later, my uncle insisted he didn't know what had grabbed him, but in a hushed voice he admitted to us kids that it felt like something alive, something malevolent. From that day forward, he refused to fish in that part of the river again. Even now, years later, he sticks to shallow waters with a rod and line, far from the deep places where he nearly lost his life. He still warns us, his voice low and serious. There's something down there, and I'll never tempt it again. The second story, The Invisible Creature. I hesitated for a long time before deciding to share this story. Even now, I'm unsure how to describe what happened because it doesn't fit neatly into any category. I've heard plenty of tales about ghosts, cryptids, and other strange phenomena, and I've always been the kind of person to label things, to rationalize them somehow. But what I experienced defied every explanation I tried to give it. It wasn't just unsettling, it felt dangerous. Like whatever it was wanted to hurt someone. And though I've tried to push it from my mind, the memory clings like a shadow in the back of my thoughts, refusing to let go. The building where I worked wasn't the sort of place you'd expect strange things to happen. It wasn't old or creaky, nor did it have the eerie, dimly lit hallways of a horror movie. On the contrary, it was modern, clean, and well lit, even the attic. That attic was unusually large and spacious for a commercial building, with heavy metal racking installed along the walls. The racks were sturdy enough to hold a ton of weight, but loose enough that they'd rattle loudly if someone ran across them. For the most part, the attic felt safe, almost boring in its plainness. But over time, little things started happening that made me uneasy. The first time I sensed something was wrong was late one evening after closing. I had gone out into the courtyard to put up signs for the next day, a simple task I'd done countless times before. The courtyard had a heavy metal ceiling 2 stories above, and the area was usually still and quiet after hours. As I approached the first automatic door, it opened well before I reached the sensor range. At first, I didn't think much of it, maybe a glitch or a breeze, but then a wave of unease washed over me, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't explain it, but some primal instinct screamed at me not to step forward. I tried to ignore the feeling and took a longer route to another door closer to where I needed to place the signs. As I neared it, the door opened too, again far earlier than it should have. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt as though something invisible had passed through, standing just beyond my sight. The air felt thick, like static before a storm. I forced myself to keep moving, brushing off the unease as fatigue from a long day. But the moment I stepped into the courtyard, I felt eyes on me. I couldn't see anything on the high beams above, but I heard something, soft, deliberate scraping, like claws raking against the metal. My heart pounded as I looked up, expecting to see a bird or rodent scurrying across the rafters. But the beams were empty, gleaming white under the dim lights. Whatever it was stayed hidden, following me silently as I placed the signs. I walked briskly toward the exit, refusing to let myself run. Then, from behind me, came the sound of a heavy box being dropped onto the concrete with a crash. I spun around. A large shipping container sat dented and tilted, though I was certain it hadn't been that way earlier. Something heavy must have struck it, or landed on it. Fighting the urge to panic, I made my way back inside to where a few co-workers remained. The automatic doors opened behind me with a hiss. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. No figure, no shadow, just emptiness. That night, I didn't mention what I felt or heard. What could I say? That I thought something invisible had followed me? Even to me it sounded ridiculous. A few days later, I had to run supplies up to the attic. Taking the elevator, I felt a chill creep over me as soon as the door slid shut. Halfway up, the same sound returned, claws dragging over metal, echoing faintly through the shaft. It was closer this time, moving just out of sight. As I stepped off the elevator, I kept my gaze fixed ahead, refusing to look around. I told myself that focusing on it would only make it worse. I learned that about strange things, acknowledging them often makes them bolder. While sorting boxes, I heard soft thuds on the beams above, then a distinct sound of something descending the stairs at the far end of the attic. I froze. My mind screamed at me not to turn, but some deeper instinct pulled me to glance over my shoulder. I saw nothing, yet the air felt thick, charged with a presence so oppressive it made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the sense that if I allowed myself to look too long or too hard, it would reveal itself. And I didn't want to see it. On my way back to the elevator, I felt it again, that weight in the air like a predator circling prey. The metal racks rattled softly as though something massive shifted its weight across them. When I reached the elevator, my heart thundered in my chest. I heard a loud thump on the wooden floor just outside the doors, then felt the air shift as if something entered the small space with me. I didn't look. Somehow, I knew it was there, standing over me, waiting. Instead of panicking, I reached out my hand carefully to where I sensed it might be. The air felt cold and dense, and then the elevator jolted, as if something large had recoiled from my touch. The doors opened, and I stepped out as calmly as I could manage. Since that day, I've stayed silent about what happened. But the attic hasn't been quiet. Colleagues have been injured in bizarre accidents, heavy beams falling unexpectedly, people tripping over nothing. One co-worker even suffering a severe head injury after being slammed into a metal rack by something unseen. The others whisper about bad luck and faulty equipment, but deep down I know better. Whatever it is, it's still there, lurking unseen in the shadows, growing bolder with each passing day. The third story, Wolf Creature. It happened 2 years ago in the vast, untamed wilderness of Colorado. The memory still lingers in my mind, vivid and haunting, like an unfinished nightmare. Back then, I often sought solace in nature, using long hikes through the forest as a way to clear my head during difficult times. My Labrador retriever, Remy, was my faithful companion, his joyful presence making those lonely treks feel a little less heavy. He was 7 years old at the time, a gentle and obedient dog who never strayed far from my side. On that particular evening in late August, I packed a simple dinner and set off into the Uncompahgre forest, hoping to return to the car before the sun dipped too low. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the scurrying of chipmunks. Even a distant black bear sighting didn't alarm me. Remy and I kept our distance and continued on our path. Eventually we stopped along the edge of a canyon ridge to rest and eat. I shared my thoughts aloud with Remy, speaking softly as if he understood every word. He sat beside me, wagging his tail, his warm eyes fixed on mine as I vented about friendships and the trials of high school. It felt comforting to talk, even if he couldn't reply. When the last of our meal was gone, I packed up and stood, calling to Remy to follow me back. He leapt to his feet, his enthusiasm unchanging despite the long walk. For a while everything felt normal, but then, about a mile from where we'd eaten, I felt something shift. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the faintest whisper of unease settling over me. I slowed my pace, scanning the woods, telling myself it was nothing. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. Then Remy froze. His ears perked, his body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. The fur along his spine stood on end. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, only growled deeper and stared into the dense trees to our right. I followed his gaze, but I saw nothing, just shadows and underbrush. Then, without warning, Remy lunged forward, pulling free of his leash. "Remy! Get back here!" I shouted, my heart pounding as I chased after him. He never disobeyed me like this, not once in all our years together. That was when the fear began to take root. I followed the sound of his barking through the forest, my breaths growing ragged as branches clawed at my arms. When I finally caught up, Remy was standing rigid, his body low to the ground, growling ferociously at a massive dark shape ahead of us. My stomach dropped. At first glance, it looked like a wolf, but not an ordinary one. It was enormous, with thick dark fur and a single patch of silver over one eye. Its eyes glowed red in the dim light, reflecting something primal and terrifying. The creature's legs were long and powerful, its chest broad and muscular. Even on all fours, its head nearly reached my chin. I froze, barely breathing, as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. "It's okay. We're not here to hurt you," I whispered shakily, taking slow steps backward. The creature's lips curled into a silent snarl, exposing sharp teeth stained with dried blood. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I stood my ground, terrified of provoking it. Slowly, it began to move closer, each step deliberate, calculated. Then, in a blur of motion, Remy lunged. The leash slipped from my hands as he hurled himself at the creature, but instead of attacking, the beast reared back on two legs. My breath caught in my throat. Its transformation was unnatural, horrifying. The hind legs straightened, the chest expanded, and in seconds it stood upright like a man. Its massive frame towered over me, its clawed hands flexing as it bared its teeth in an expression that was neither fully animal nor fully human. Remy whimpered and backed away, tail tucked, pressing against my legs. The creature circled us slowly, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, locked between the instinct to flee and the knowledge that running would make me prey. It lowered its muzzle to sniff the air around me, its breath hot and foul. I felt the muscles in my legs twitch, ready to bolt, but I forced myself still. Then, without warning, the creature threw back its head and let out a chilling howl that echoed through the forest. The sound reverberated in my chest, primal and otherworldly. Somewhere deep inside, survival instinct took over. Grabbing Remy's collar, I shoved the beast's chest with all my strength and ran. Branches whipped my face as I sprinted through the trees, my dog racing alongside me. Behind us, I could hear the heavy footfalls of the creature giving chase, its howl still ringing in my ears. We broke through the tree line onto the road just as the roar of an approaching semi-truck reached my ears. The creature stopped at the edge of the woods, retreating into the darkness as the headlights illuminated the path. I didn't slow down until we reached the car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Hours later, in the stillness of my room, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl outside my window. The sound of claws scraped down the siding, slow and deliberate. My blood turned to ice. Remy stayed silent but trembled at my side, his wide eyes fixed on the glass. I never saw the creature again, but I moved away soon after and stopped hiking in those woods. Even now, years later, I can still hear that howl in my dreams, and I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting. The fourth story, headphones in the woods. There was a time in my life when I considered the forest my sanctuary. I loved camping alone on quiet weekends, miles away from the bustle of the city. It was a way to recharge my soul, to breathe air untouched by exhaust fumes and listen to the whispers of nature. But one summer evening changed everything. It wasn't just the forest's silence that unnerved me, it was what emerged from it. I haven't set foot in the woods since, and I can't bring myself to wear headphones outdoors anymore. If you've ever felt alone in the wilderness, I hope you never learn what it's like to realize you aren't. It was July 7th, 2017, and I'd been counting down to my weekend escape. I worked grueling 12-hour shifts 4 days a week, leaving me just enough time to catch up on errands and chores. So when I finally had 3 days off in a row, I packed my camping gear and headed for the mountains, eager to unwind. I even brought along my favorite headphones, thinking I'd catch up on videos and podcasts as I rested by the fire. That Friday evening I parked at the trailhead and hiked for 30 minutes to a small clearing I had discovered the year before. It was perfect, shaded by towering conifers, the ground soft with moss and leaves. As I set up camp, I felt an odd shiver crawl up the back of my neck. For a moment, I could have sworn I felt someone's breath, warm and deliberate, brushing against my skin. I froze, counting silently, 3, 2, 1, and spun around. But the forest was empty. Only shadows and stillness greeted me. Shaking it off, I went back to pitching the tent. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire, letting the crackling flames push away the darkness. With one earbud in and the other dangling loose, I scrolled through my YouTube feed. The laughter and chatter of familiar voices made me feel at ease. For nearly an hour, I watched videos, smiling at the antics on screen, forgetting the earlier unease. But then I froze. My body locked up as cold hands settled on my shoulders from behind. The touch was light, but unmistakable, ice-cold fingers pressing gently against my shirt. I didn't dare turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place. My breathing slowed, the world shrinking to the sensation of cracked, dry skin dragging across my shoulders. Then the hands moved lower, creeping down toward my chest. I saw the pale skin and yellowed fingernails in my peripheral vision, and a new wave of dread crashed over me. A cold breath brushed against my neck. My blood turned to ice as the unseen figure exhaled, its breath dry and rasping. Seconds felt like hours. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly, carefully, I raised my hands toward my headphones. I needed to hear, really hear, whatever was behind me. In one motion, I yanked the headphones off and jumped across the fire, turning to face the spot where I had been sitting. Nothing. Only flickering shadows danced in the firelight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I told myself it had to be a hallucination. Maybe exhaustion had played a cruel trick on my mind. I crawled into my tent, zipped it tightly, and stared out at the glowing embers. Hours passed before my eyes grew heavy, and I finally drifted off to sleep. I don't know what woke me later that night. Perhaps it was instinct. My hand still clutched my phone, the screen faintly glowing in the darkness. Outside, the fire had burned low, leaving only orange embers. That's when I saw her. Kneeling on the far side of the fire was a figure, small, frail and shivering. Her hair hung in matted clumps, caked with mud that covered her body like dried paint. I couldn't see her face, but her soft, rasping sobs carried through the still air. My fear faded for a moment, replaced by concern. Maybe she was lost, hurt, in need of help. Quietly, I removed the tent flap and stepped out. The moment my foot touched the ground, her head snapped up. Her face was illuminated in the dying glow of the fire, and I stumbled back in horror. She had no mouth, no nose, only 2 wide, tear-gilled eyes set into unnaturally smooth skin. I gasped, unable to breathe, as those hollow eyes bore into me. I fell backward into the tent, ripping through the nylon as I scrambled to escape. When I looked back, she was gone, but her sobs lingered, echoing faintly through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove all night, heart pounding, headlights slicing through the darkness. I've never gone camping since, and I never wear headphones outdoors anymore. Some nights, I swear I hear soft sobbing in the distance, like a memory trying to claw its way back. The fifth story. Wicked warning. It was the summer of 2005 when I finally visited New Orleans, a city steeped in beauty, history, and an undercurrent of mystery that seemed to seep from every cracked sidewalk and swaying willow tree. My partner and I had been traveling coast to coast, trucking through the states, living out of the cab of our rig. It wasn't always easy, but the lure of adventure outweighed the discomforts of the road. New Orleans had always intrigued me, not just because of its vibrant streets and music, but because of the whispers I'd heard about its cemeteries and voodoo roots. Some said the graveyards were works of art. Others said they were doorways to something darker. As we pulled into the city on an oppressively humid August afternoon, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. The air seemed heavier here, thick with moisture and an undefinable tension. The grand plantation-style homes lining the streets stood like ancient sentinels, beautiful but imposing, their histories tangled in shadows. My partner wasn't interested in exploring. He dismissed my fascination with the macabre, claiming graveyards were boring and occult shops were nonsense. But there was something about Lafayette Cemetery that called to me, and I wasn't about to leave New Orleans without seeing it for myself. We parked near the edge of a quiet neighborhood, and I stepped out of the truck with my camera in hand. I had only recently started using a 35mm, and while it was considered outdated even then, I loved the ritual of photography, clicking the shutter, rolling the film, waiting to see what the lens had truly captured. My partner stayed behind, content to nap in the cab. "Call me when you're done," he muttered, tossing me a prepaid cell phone with just a handful of minutes left. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I welcomed it. The gates of Lafayette Cemetery loomed before me, wrought iron twisted into elegant designs that seemed almost alive. As I stepped inside, I felt an odd chill despite the sweltering heat. The mausoleums stood like miniature houses, some pristine and adorned with fresh flowers, others cracked and crumbling, overtaken by creeping moss. The pathways wove between them like veins, leading deeper into the heart of the graveyard. With every step I felt as if unseen eyes followed me, though I told myself it was only my imagination. I paused to photograph a stone angel, its weathered face streaked by rain and time. The light was dimming, the sun dipping behind a tangle of trees that reached hungrily toward the sky. I checked my watch and realized I'd lost track of time. The oppressive heat seemed to fade, replaced by a creeping cold that raised goosebumps along my arms. I quickened my pace, heading back toward the entrance, but the cemetery felt different now. The air was heavier, thicker somehow, as though it resisted every breath. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman stood near one of the tombs, dressed in bright, flowing fabrics that seemed to shimmer despite the fading light. A colourful headscarf wrapped around her grey hair, and necklaces of wood or bone draped her thin frame. Her presence was sudden, jarring, as though she had materialized from the shadows themselves. I froze, startled, as her milky white eye fixed on me. The other eye darted back and forth, sharp and searching. She beckoned to me with a crooked finger. Against every instinct screaming for me to leave, I stepped closer. Perhaps she needed help, I reasoned. Perhaps she was lost. As I drew near, her hand shot out with surprising speed and gripped my arm like a vise. Her fingers were strong, her nails digging crescent moons into my skin. The smell that emanated from her was thick and metallic, like rotting leaves mixed with rust. "Leave this place," she rasped in a voice like cracked stone, "or you will drown for your sins." My heart pounded as I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that I meant no harm, but her gaze silenced me. Her blackened teeth peeked through chapped lips, and her breath was hot and sour. Just then, my phone rang, the shrill tone shattering the moment like glass. The woman recoiled, releasing my arm with a force that sent me stumbling backward. I didn't even remember dialing, but my partner's voice crackled through the speaker, asking where I was. By the time I regained my balance and looked back, the woman was gone. The path where she had stood was empty, the air still and heavy. I ran to the gate, my pulse hammering, and didn't stop until I saw the familiar shape of our truck parked on the curb. As I climbed inside, my partner looked at me, confused by my pale face and trembling hands. "What happened?" he asked. I tried to answer, but the words caught in my throat. When I finally looked back toward the cemetery, the woman was nowhere in sight. 2 weeks later, Hurricane Katrina ravaged New Orleans, flooding its streets and drowning its graveyards. I often wonder what would have happened if I had stayed longer that evening, ignoring the old woman's warning. Even now, when I think of her grip and those clouded eyes, I feel a chill settle deep in my bones. I'll never know what she was or if she was real at all, but her words echo in my mind. "Leave this place, or you will drown for your sins." The sixth story. Terrorized, alone in the woods. There's a quiet thrill to traveling alone, a kind of serene confidence that comes from relying only on yourself and the vast open world around you. At least, that's how I used to feel before that night in the Australian bush. I was 26, adventurous, and perhaps a little too bold for my own good. My Toyota van had become my second home as I wandered the rugged landscape of southern New South Wales. I had driven from Mount Kosciuszko, heading north toward the Blue Mountains, but I wanted to break up the journey by camping in a remote state park. Little did I know, this decision would haunt me for years to come. The road leading into the park was rough, uneven dirt and sharp rocks that rattled the van so hard I thought the wheels might give out. The 30 kilometers to the campsite took over an hour, and by the time I arrived I was weary and on edge. But when I stepped out and looked around, the isolation wrapped around me like a warm, familiar blanket. The air was crisp and earthy, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. Not a single car or person in sight. It was perfect. After parking near a small fire pit, I strung my longbow and went in search of rabbits. The little creatures darted around a nearby meadow, but they were skittish and too clever for me. I gave up after a while, returning to camp to light a fire and pour myself a glass of whiskey. I leaned back against the van, smoking a cigarette and soaking in the peace. The stars began to peek out, shimmering like scattered jewels across the dark velvet sky. Despite the rough drive, I was glad I had come. Yet beneath the calm, a faint unease pricked at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't anything tangible, just an instinct. A slight pressure in my chest, as if the air had grown heavier. I had felt this before in the bush, a subtle warning that something wasn't right. But I had brushed it off. It was too late to drive back, and besides, the whiskey was already working its way through my veins. I climbed into my van and fell asleep to the crackling of the fire outside. Sometime after midnight, a loud crack jolted me awake. It sounded like a gunshot in the distance, faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but silence returned to the valley. Perhaps a hunter in the nearby hills, I reasoned, trying to settle my nerves. I lay back down, though sleep came only in restless fragments. An hour later, another shot shattered the stillness, this one louder, closer. My stomach tightened as I peered through the curtains. The embers of the fire still glowed faintly, casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. My mind raced. What if hunters were nearby and didn't know I was here? What if a stray bullet hit the van? I thought about rekindling the fire to make my presence known, but decided against it. Then I heard it. The sound of tires crunching slowly over the rocky dirt road leading into the campsite. My blood turned cold. No one should be out here at this hour. Not on a dead-end road this remote. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the low growl of an engine. I froze. gripping the handle of my hunting knife as the headlights washed over the van. The vehicle stopped a few feet away, its blinding lights aimed directly at me. I crouched low, holding my breath as the engine revved, the sound deep and aggressive. Then the doors creaked open. Heavy footsteps crunched over the gravel, slow and deliberate. Someone was approaching the van. My mind raced through impossible scenarios. Could I drive away? No, the road was too narrow and they were blocking the only exit. Should I run into the bush? It was too dark and I didn't know the terrain well enough to escape. The footsteps stopped just outside the van. I heard breathing, slow, steady, almost inhumanly calm. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated. The doors slammed shut and the engine roared to life. The vehicle reversed slowly, headlights sweeping the campsite before vanishing into the darkness. I didn't move for a long time, paralyzed by fear and confusion. When dawn finally broke, I packed my things with shaking hands and drove back down the rocky road, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror at every bend. I never saw the vehicle or its occupants again. But the memory of those footsteps, the deliberate way they circled my van, still echoes in my mind. Since that night, I've never camped in a remote site alone, and I don't think I ever will again. The seventh story, I survived the Dogman. It was November of 2015 and Vermont's dense forests were just beginning to settle into winter's grasp. The air was crisp and cold, with faint traces of snow clinging to the ground in shaded patches. I was young then, restless, bold, and convinced that I was ready to face the wilderness alone. I had brought only a hatchet, a machete, and a bottle of water. My mind buzzed with confidence, but beneath that bravado was a naivety I wouldn't fully understand until much later. I thought I could handle anything the forest could throw at me. I was wrong. The stretch of woods I chose spanned over 100 acres, thick with spruce trees that blotted out much of the fading sunlight. I ventured deeper into the woods than I should have, searching for a spot to build a makeshift deer blind. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling squirrels faded into silence so thick it felt suffocating. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing more than my imagination. I began working with my hatchet, chopping down dead branches to lean against the blind I was building. Each strike echoed through the stillness, sharp and unnatural. That's when I heard it, a faint snapping sound behind me. I froze, gripping the handle of my hatchet tightly. Slowly I turned, scanning the dense undergrowth, but saw nothing. The forest was still, though the air felt different now, heavier, colder. I shook my head and went back to work, telling myself it was probably a deer stepping on a branch. But the snapping sound came again, this time from a different direction. My heart started to race. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was being watched. I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on the rhythmic chopping of wood, though my ears strained to catch any further sounds. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep enough to rattle my bones. Slowly, I turned again, and this time I saw it. Standing just 15 feet away was a creature that defied explanation. At first glance, it looked like a massive wolf, but something about it was wrong. Its legs were too long, its chest too broad, and its face bore an expression almost human in its malice. The beast's fur was dark and matted, and its claws were impossibly long, glinting faintly even in the dim light. It stared at me with yellow, predatory eyes, lips curling back in a terrifying semblance of a grin. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized how utterly defenseless I was. I gripped my machete with trembling hands, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I began backing away slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the creature. It mirrored my movements, stepping forward each time I stepped back. Its movements were deliberate, controlled, as though it was toying with me. Then, in one fluid motion, it stood upright on its hind legs. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the full height of the beast. It was massive, towering over me with a grotesque, muscular frame that seemed more man than wolf. It snarled, baring rows of sharp, glistening teeth, and took another step forward. I could feel my body trembling, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The creature raised one clawed hand, flexing its fingers as if testing the sharpness of its talons. Then, for reasons I still don't understand, it stopped. It sniffed the air, emitted a deep, rumbling growl, and slowly backed away into the shadows, its glowing eyes the last thing to vanish in the underbrush. I didn't wait to see if it would return. As soon as I could move, I bolted, heart pounding so hard it drowned out all other sounds. I didn't stop running until I broke through the tree line and saw the faint glimmer of the road in the distance. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running until I collapsed next to my car. To this day, I don't know why it let me go. Maybe it didn't see me as worth the effort. Or perhaps it was playing some game I didn't understand. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. There are things out there that don't belong to our world. Things that watch, that wait. And if you're unlucky enough to meet their gaze, you might not be as fortunate as I was. The 8th story. Subled, Idaho hunting trip. A few years ago, I was invited by my friend Matt to join him on a deer hunting trip in the mountain ranges of Idaho. It was a place neither of us had ever explored before, and the unknown always carried a certain thrill. Matt had gone up a few days ahead with his young son to set up camp and scout the area. When I arrived early one crisp autumn morning, the camp was empty. I figured they had gone out hunting before sunrise, so I decided to take a look around on my own before they returned. Little did I know this trip would leave me questioning my instincts and fearing the stillness of the woods like never before. I parked my ATV and unpacked my gear. Pulling on the hand-sewn ghillie suit I had made the week prior, I felt a surge of excitement. The fresh pine-scented air filled my lungs as I set out to explore. The forest was beautiful in that quiet, reverent way only wilderness, untouched by people, can be. For hours I wandered, my rifle at the ready, scanning for any signs of movement. But strangely, I saw nothing, not a single deer, not even a squirrel scurrying across the branches. The absence of life felt off, but I kept moving, convincing myself it was just bad timing. Eventually I stumbled into an area that had been ravaged by fire earlier that year. The sight was sobering. Charred trees stood like blackened skeletons against a pale sky, and ash clung stubbornly to the earth. I had never been in a burn area before, and there was something haunting about the silence that clung to it. As I walked along the ridgeline, I spotted a bare patch of dirt at the bottom of a ravine. From my vantage point, it seemed about 250 yards away, perfect for testing the rifle's scope. I adjusted my sights and took a shot at a rock resting in the clearing. The sound echoed across the barren land, startling even me. The shot was perfect. Feeling a fleeting sense of satisfaction, I decided it was time to head back. As I retraced my steps through the desolate terrain, the wind picked up slightly, whistling through the scorched branches like a ghostly sigh. When I returned to camp, I found Matt and his son preparing their freshly bagged deer. They were both in good spirits, and we spent the next few hours chatting about their success, the burn area I had wandered through, and even a moose sighting they'd had, a rare thing in these mountains. Later, Matt decided to drive down the mountain to call his wife and arrange for her to pick up his son. As their truck rumbled away, I stayed behind, sipping coffee by the fire and staring into the woods. After a while, I decided to head out again, this time toward a creek not far from camp. Matt had told me he'd seen plenty of deer tracks there, and it felt promising. The trail wound through an aspen grove, golden leaves shimmering like coins in the fading afternoon light. The air was cool and fragrant, with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I let the beauty of it all lull me into a calm state, but deep down, A quiet unease was beginning to bloom. As I ventured deeper, the trees gave way to a thicker stand of pines, their low-hanging branches forcing me to duck and weave. I began noticing something odd. The branches seemed battered and broken, as though large animals had been passing through repeatedly. I pushed forward, hopeful. Then I saw it. A patch of bare earth crisscrossed with deer and elk tracks. The realization brought a flicker of excitement. I was on their trail. But that excitement was short-lived. Scattered among the tracks and bones of small animals, I spotted something that made my stomach clench. Large piles of scat, unmistakably from a predator. A chill ran through me. Slowly I turned to leave, every nerve in my body urging me to get out of there. As I retraced my steps, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I returned to camp, Matt was still gone. I threw more wood onto the fire and sat, clutching my rifle tighter than before. Then I saw movement on the hillside across from me. A large, dark shape lumbering through the trees. At first I thought it was another moose, but something about its movements felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too quiet for an animal of that size. The shape disappeared into the shadows before I could get a closer look through my scope. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified in the stillness. I couldn't shake the memory of that dark figure on the hill, or the eerie silence in the burned-out forest. The next morning I told Matt I wasn't going back into those woods. He laughed it off, saying I must have let the isolation get to me, but deep down I know there was something out there. Something that had been watching me, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. The night story. Truck stop horror. It was 2011 when I found myself working as a long-haul trucker, crisscrossing the country from coast to coast. The road can be a lonely place, but there's a certain comfort in the steady hum of the engine and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead. That night, I was heading through the remote stretches of Arizona, hauling a load of machinery bound for a construction site outside Tucson. The desert air was cool and dry, the sky above alive with stars that seemed almost close enough to touch. I had planned to push through the night, but fatigue eventually won. Spotting a truck stop off the highway, I pulled in and parked among a row of other rigs. The place wasn't anything special, just a faded sign glowing weakly in the darkness and a diner that smelled of stale coffee and grease. But to a weary driver, it was paradise. I grabbed a booth inside, ordered a burger and black coffee, and listened to the low murmur of other truckers swapping stories. Their voices blended with the faint hiss of a distant television tuned to static. After eating, I headed back to my truck, planning to grab a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. The parking lot was nearly full, but I managed to find a spot at the far end, under the dim glow of a flickering light. I shut off the engine, cracked the window to let in some air, and reclined in my seat. The hum of idling engines lulled me towards sleep. For a while everything was peaceful. Then I woke with a start. At first I wasn't sure what had roused me, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. The air felt heavier, colder, and the faint scent of something metallic wafted through the cracked window. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock. 2:37 a.m. The lot was silent now. Most of the other rigs had shut off their engines, and an eerie stillness settled over the place. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching softly over the gravel. They didn't sound like boots or heavy work shoes. No, these were lighter, almost delicate, barefoot. My stomach tightened as I peered through the side mirror. A pale figure moved between the trucks, its shape blurred in the flickering light. For a moment I thought it was a woman, but something about the way it walked, smooth, gliding almost, sent a chill racing down my spine. The figure stopped a few trucks down, its head tilting unnaturally to one side as though listening. Then it began moving again, closing the distance between us. My pulse quickened. I reached for the door lock and quietly pressed it down, the faint click loud in the silence. The figure's head snapped toward my truck. I froze. Even in the dim light, I could see its face now, or rather, the absence of one. Where its features should have been was only smooth, pale skin stretched taut over bone. I held my breath as it approached, its bare feet making no sound now. It stopped, inches from my door, its faceless head tilting again as if studying me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly, it raised one hand, thin fingers splayed like pale spider legs, and dragged them across the glass. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a soft, scraping caress. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The thing stood there for what felt like an eternity, fingers tapping lightly against the window. Then, without warning, it turned and began gliding away, vanishing into the darkness between the rows of trucks. I sat frozen, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, too afraid to even exhale. When dawn finally broke, I started the engine and left without stopping for breakfast or coffee. As I merged onto the highway, I glanced in my mirrors again and again, half expecting to see that pale figure standing at the edge of the road. But there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of asphalt and the rising sun behind me. I've stopped at countless truck stops since then, but I never park at the far end of the lot anymore. And whenever I crack the window to let in air, I can't help but remember that soft scraping sound and wonder if it's still out there, searching for another driver, bold or unlucky enough to leave themselves vulnerable in the dead of night. The 10-story horror in the cornfield. When I was 17, I spent the summer working on my uncle's farm in rural Iowa. The land stretched for miles in every direction, nothing but golden fields of corn swaying gently under the sun. At first, the isolation felt peaceful, a welcome change from the noise of the city. But that peace didn't last. Something about those endless rows of corn began to gnaw at me as the weeks passed, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the work. I didn't mind the long hours and sore muscles. No, it was something else. Something hidden deep within the stalks. Watching. My uncle's farmhouse was modest but sturdy, perched at the edge of the largest field. Every night I'd sit on the porch with a glass of water, staring at the dark silhouettes of the corn swaying under the moonlight. The wind made them whisper, and sometimes, if I listened closely, I swore I could hear faint voices carried on the breeze. My uncle dismissed it as imagination. City kids mind playing tricks, he'd say with a chuckle, but I wasn't so sure. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, I volunteered to check the irrigation pipes before heading in for supper. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of purple and gold. I grabbed a flashlight and trudged into the rows, the crunch of dry soil beneath my boots breaking the silence. The corn towered above me, their leaves brushing against my arms like cold fingers. I kept telling myself to relax, but the deeper I went, the heavier the air seemed to grow. I was about halfway through the field when I heard it, a soft rustling that didn't match the breeze. I stopped, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone or something moving deliberately through the rows. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam revealed only stalks of corn swaying lazily. Probably a raccoon, I muttered to myself, trying to steady my nerves. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to finish and get back to the safety of the farmhouse. Then I heard a whisper. Faint at first, so soft I almost missed it. "Ye shouldn't be here." The voice was low and raspy, drifting from somewhere deep within the corn. My stomach clenched as I froze in place, straining to listen. "You don't belong," it hissed again, this time from a different direction. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I swept it frantically across the stalks. Nothing. Just the endless rows stretching out in every direction. Panic surged through me. I turned and started walking briskly back the way I had come, but the path didn't look right. The rows seemed narrower now, the stalks leaning in closer as though trying to swallow me whole. My footsteps grew louder in the oppressive silence. each crunch echoing unnaturally in my ears. That's when I heard it behind me, the sound of footsteps, light but deliberate, mirroring my own. I broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as shadows seemed to dance just out of reach. My lungs burned and my legs ached as the whispers grew louder, surrounding me from every side. "You'll never leave," they murmured. "Stay with us." A cold breeze rushed past my neck and I felt the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing my shoulder. I screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly, but the beam only revealed empty stalks. Bursting through the edge of the field, I stumbled into the open yard, gasping for air. The farmhouse lights glowed warmly ahead, a beacon of safety. I sprinted for the porch, slamming the door shut behind me. My uncle looked up from his chair, startled. "What the hell's gotten into you, boy?" he asked. But I couldn't speak. Only point back toward the cornfield with trembling hands. He shook his head, muttering something about city kids and overactive imaginations, but I didn't argue. That night I refused to sleep near the windows, pulling the curtains tightly closed. Still, I could hear the corn rustling in the wind, the faint whispers carrying on the night air. "Stay with us." By the end of the summer, I swore I'd never set foot in another cornfield again. Even now, years later, whenever I see stalks swaying in the breeze, a chill creeps down my spine. Some places aren't meant for us to wander, and some voices aren't meant to be heard.